All right, well, let's move to the third position. The fourth position. This is the last position that he wants us to see. And this one's kind of different than the rest of them. He calls it prophetic ethics. And he says of the ethical paradigms in this volume, prophetic ethics may have the broadest range of expressions. However, several shared characteristics kind of set it apart. First, prophetic ethics, he tells us, finds its foundation in ecclesiology and mission rather than the divine attributes, like the divine command theory, or a vision of human flourishing, like natural law and virtue ethics. Mm-hmm. So this ecclesial model, he tells us, means that while the other models find their primary expression in individual ethics, right, telling me what I should do, although they're clearly applicable to social ethics, the starting point for prophetic ethics, he tells us, is social justice, which is underscored to be the visible reflection of the values of God's kingdom. Mm-hmm. So this one has to do with, our social responsibilities with regard to the world.
Right. All right. So what does that look like?
Yeah.
An additional characteristic of prophetic ethics is its emphasis on the corporate dimensions of sin. Forms of Christian ethics that focus attention on individual behaviors and decisions fall if they fail to recognize the principalities and powers, or organized systems established by the powerful who are the primary beneficiaries. And as a result of that, there are those outside the circle of social and economic powers are excluded and unheard.
Right. So now what we'll see as he continues to refine this definition is something, that's rather contemporary now. Right. Will come into view here, right? And so he further says, a final general characteristic of prophetic ethics is criticism of approaches that fix attention on theory and doctrine, while failing to engage the world on behalf of the silenced and the poor. Right? So not a focus on theory and doctrine, but a focus on people who are silenced and who are, in poverty. So
you people in your ivory tower, that you just sit there and think, and oh, yeah, how many angels dance on the head of a pin? I'm out here in the soup line giving to the poor.
Exactly. So he says, instead of grounding ethics on the theoretical foundation, some segments of prophetic ethics emphasize what he calls praxis, right? So that's kind of, practicing the principles, right?
In economics, and one of the economic theories that I've subscribed to, praxeology, the fact that people act with purpose. Now, it might be the correct purpose, but they act with a purpose. And so how people make decisions based on what they give their money to, or how they make decisions on economic theory. Once I saw the word praxis, I was like, hey, I've mentioned that a few times in this show too.
Yeah. And oftentimes Christians make the distinction between orthodoxy and orthopraxy.
Yeah. There you go.
Right teaching versus right practice, nice. Right? So that's the idea here. So the activity of the community, he's saying here, in constant conversation with the narrative that sustains the community. So the language of praxis, then, this practice, recognizes that social structures and traditions, embedded ways of life that transcend rational analysis, even determine what is considered rational. Thus, we're called, according to this particular approach, to immerse ourselves in the world through engagement and not, this distance ivory tower analysis.
Right. Well, the social gospel movement of the early 20th century vividly illustrates this. At the heart of the social gospel is an emphasis on the corporate dimension of sin. Thus, the social gospel moved from the church to the streets, often aligning itself with the labor movements and seeking the right to organize, better wages, and humane working conditions. It adopted populist political agendas, and many advocated Christian socialism as a necessary step towards economic justice. And again, we have this kind of contemporary idea of these things, and we say, in 2008, this thing just kind of reared its ugly head. No, actually, 20th century. I mean, the fact that Christianity didn't all be encompassed, at least in the West, to this social justice movement, read your history about that era and just realize just how prevalent that was, how focused it was, and the fact that we came away from it for a certain amount of time was a feat of miraculous intervention.
Yeah, yeah. And also, he says liberation theology retains the social gospel's concern for the poor and engagement with the social dimension of sin, but spreads in new directions. Liberationist thought transcends the social gospel's kind of North American context to encompass Latin America, feminism, African, Asia, and Black theologies, just to mention a few, he says. So liberation theology argues, as the name signifies, that the gospel message is one of liberation, right? And thus liberationists are critical of those who read the Exodus story, for instance, as deliverance from, bad habits and individual sins, while ignoring the physical, financial, and political enslavement experienced by the majority in the world yet today.
When leaving from Egypt, the Egyptians gave the exiting Jews a lot of gold to get out of there. So maybe their reparations can be their story of reparations can be used in ours. Yeah. So this is something that obviously has a big impact in our world today, for good or for bad. But here it's being used in an ethical framework here. All right, particularly critical in this process is a thorough re-examination of biblical interpretation, since the Bible was used in the colonial past not to only save, but also to civilize native peoples, and thus make legitimate the claims made by the colonizers that their dominance over the colonized was justified. Prophetic ethics frequently refers to Jubilee as a pivotal ethical passage in the Old Testament. The command that slaves are to be freed and all property returned to its original owners or heirs on the 50th year, as seen in Leviticus 25, is viewed as a model for erasing structural economic inequalities within the community. So all those dollars that I gave to the sporting events, if they just want to return them to me after such and such time, then I can't even tell you who plays baseball anymore. But those people that make 3 commas in their salary can go back to living like me for at least a good little amount of time.
That's right. So that's kind of the Old Testament support of he's suggesting a way of this particular ethical approach. What about the New Testament? Excuse me. Well, it says in the New Testament, the words and activities of Jesus take central stage in prophetic ethics. In Matthew 25, 31 through 46, Jesus states that the standard by which we will be judged is determined by our response to those in need. Also, at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus closely ties his messianic identity to the prophetic message of justice and liberation and healing for the poor, captive, blind, and oppressed, right? As we see in Isaiah 61. And so he says, perhaps more than any other scriptural passage, however, prophetic ethics cites the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 and Luke 6, and its message of hope and blessing for the persecuted and the dispossessed. And so those are kind of the scriptural support for this particular approach.
Right. And so I know you might be tempted to just dismiss that one as being the wacky one. But I think there's a lot of positives and a lot of valid argumentations that you can make. And if you say, "Oh, I don't care about any of that," well, then learning from it is a good way to combat it. So instead of just making fun of it and making memes from it, if you understand it and are able to respond to those points that it makes or implies or levies against you, then all the better, because then you're more informed. So,
of course, though, I'd like to see the memes, but anyway.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, right. So, you take reparations from this area and then you just move it to the world and say, all right, now you have to give all your reparations to the areas that you colonized from 5,000 years ago.